These are some of the interesting statistics that were cited from different studies from the National Park and Recreation Association. People living within 1 mile of a park were 4 times as likely to visit that park once a week or more. They had more physically active exercise sessions per week than those who lived further away from parks. Citizens who had better access to parks visited parks more frequently and engaged in physically active park behaviors, and interestingly, made fewer visits to the doctor. And neighborhoods with a greater proportion of parks were more likely to contain children who had higher levels of physical abilities. In Santa Barbara, as we began to prepare for the general plan update, we worked with MIG to do a baseline study of our parks and recreation facilities, how they currently meet or don't meet community demand, and how they're projected to what the needs are for the year 2015. And so the upshot of this is you can see that we have different classifications of parks, but basically we're about 16%, estimated to be about 16% shy in the number of acres that we as a community should be dedicating to parks and recreation facilities as compared to the national average. When we look at our facilities, we have 16 different facilities. I actually, when I came to Santa Barbara, and I grew up here, but as I came back as a professional that had familiarity with a lot of other park and recreation programs in other communities, I was really surprised at the lack of quality facilities, much less facilities that we had as a community. I lived for many years in the West LA area and was familiar with Santa Monica. I always thought it was very interesting that Santa Monica had the same challenge. And, you know, they had old, outdated facilities that were small, and then you'd go down to some place in these kind of burgeoning, growing communities of Orange County, and they'd have all these beautiful facilities, just multi-purpose facilities. Well, like Santa Monica, that is our challenge. And the baseline study indicates that we really need to be looking for the place to construct or renovate and have one large multi-purpose recreation center. And the city conducted a study several years ago which indicated that we definitely need a new aquatic facility. One of our other challenges is that we have an uneven distribution of parkland throughout our community. I'm going to focus on 2 types of parks because they are the parks that really have the most adjacency to our neighborhoods. One is the community parks. These are our larger parks that have a few more amenities, parks like Chase Palm Park, Oak Park, Shoreline. You can see this is a map of Santa Barbara and showing you that not all of the access is equal throughout our community. And this is a 1-mile radius. And if we look at neighborhood parks, you can see the same thing. We have, you know, some areas of the community where they have more easy access and others where there's either none or very little. I wanted us to think about some of the issues and challenges that we have. We are at a land deficit. We are a built-out city, and the cost to purchase and convert land is very expensive. We also have some redevelopment trends, which are positive in many ways for the community, but when we look at how do we compensate for that in our park and recreation and meeting the needs of our community to provide places that encourage them to be physically active or to just contribute overall to their mental health, we're a bit challenged. We are increasing our neighborhood density, you know, as people go in and they rebuild on lots and they renovate. And we are actually creating new neighborhoods in areas where we didn't really have neighborhoods before. If you think about downtown, a lot of the work that's been done on Chapala Street and some of the other areas downtown, and that's really great, it's successful, but we're not taking enough action. Because I'm not going to say we're not thinking about it, we are thinking about it, but we're not taking enough action to think about how do we design the broader community in those areas. And we also have some changing demographics in our community. We have an increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots. As you have different conversations around town, people are talking about how, we're experiencing the loss of the middle class. It's interesting, we work very closely, City Parks and Recreation work very close with the Santa Barbara School District. And, we experience a different community than I think most people in Santa Barbara really are aware that exists. In our elementary schools within the Santa Barbara School District, 58% of the students, their homes, the homes that they come from are economically disadvantaged. And that is just not the vision that people have of Santa Barbara as a community. It makes a challenge for us, frankly, when we try to go after grant funds, because that's not the image that people have of the Santa Barbara Riviera. 43% of all of our students in the elementary schools are English learners. It just again reflects the changing demographics of our community. And in our aging population, we will be experiencing, and the projections are that we will continue to experience as more people move into those older years, they will be living on more fixed incomes, and more of our elderly population is living below the poverty line. Again, not something that is traditionally associated with Santa Barbara. So looking at our issues, even if we had the space, even if we have the land opportunities, we have some challenges with funding that, to me, you need to talk about both. They're a package. High cost to purchase and convert property, but we also have challenges as a community for funding ongoing use of the buildings, so maintenance and operation. And currently, the city, we just updated our 6-year capital program. Parks and Recreation facilities alone have over $32 million in unfunded deferred maintenance. This is a challenge for us because we like to talk about new facilities and how we might do things, but really it does come down to how do we make it happen? And that needs to be a part of the discussion. Also interesting, the city is one of the larger providers of park and recreation services regionally. City has a population just over 90,000. South Coast from Carpinteria to the edges of Goleta is over 200,000. And we provide a lot of those services, and yet Parks and Recreation is primarily funded by the city's general fund. And that ought to be something that we talk about as we look to the future. We do have some issues with safety in our parks. Again, you can have the park, but if people perceive that it's not a safe place to go or be, they won't use them in the manner that they're intended. So we need to also talk about that as a community. And as always, it's political will, and that really becomes the nut to crack. We have opportunities. I mentioned that, the city and the school district work very closely in a very collaborative fashion. We have additional opportunities both with schools and other nonprofits and also businesses as we look to how we might partner together to provide some of the additional space and activity space and facilities that we mentioned. I'll just give you an example. There are cities who are very successfully partnered with junior high schools to build a gym and a teen center on the junior high school campus. They have the land, they are using it, it fits their mission, enhances their mission if we believe that physical activity is an important part of academic success, which the research shows that it is. So we have those opportunities. We really should be looking at that and having even more discussions about that. We might think about new development and partnering with residential complexes and businesses for what goes on their roof. You know, if we're land deprived, let's talk about what goes on the roof. Is it a running track, a tennis court, a basketball court? How do we get them to incorporate more physical activity geared spaces into what they're developing? And this is one of the points that came out in the baseline study was, you know, where we don't have the green space, to really look at how do we put activity space into that space, the limited space that we have. One of the big things for me as the Parks and Recreation Director, as I go around and I'm walking through our parks, is I'm amazed at how few of our parks are really designed to encourage walking. You know, Oak Park is one of my favorite parks, but the trail is uneven. If you're walking with somebody, I take my mom walking all the time, and the only place that she can really walk is Shoreline Park because it's a gradual incline, it's got large flat sidewalks. So we really need to be looking at how do we do more walking trails through our park that encourage people to get out and continue their walks through the communities, but enjoying the parks as well. And just one final thing, I think that it is very important for us to look at updating our Parks and Recreation General Plan. I wanted to close just with some pictures of what really happens in our parks and facilities. It really is about giving a place for people to do the things that feed their soul, feed their spirit, and encourage people to get out and enjoy the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for a very comprehensive, compact overview of our situation here with Santa Barbara Parks. Let's move right into Terry Dressler.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. One thing that people sometimes don't realize about the Air Pollution Control District is that our primary mission is a public health mission. People think of us as protecting the environment, protecting the air quality, but the whole reason that air pollution control districts exist is to protect the public health from the effects of air pollution. Today I'm going to go over some air pollution trends, then we'll talk about some of the challenges in when you design the built community and how you have to consider the potential impacts of air pollution there. This is my good news slide. By any measure, our air quality has been getting better over the years. There are 3 measures of our air quality that are displayed on this slide. All of them have to do with the concentration of the pollutant ozone in our air quality. One of them is the California 8-hour standard, and all that means is that it's averaged over an 8-hour period. There's the federal 8-hour standard, also averaged over an 8-hour period. And then probably the most stringent one up there is the California 1-hour standard for ozone. And this is the highest, the averaged highest 1-hour health standard. And so that's the kind of one of the toughest ones to meet, although the California 8-hour standard is also very health protective also, as well. As you can see, the trend on all of those standards is our air is getting cleaner and cleaner. We are in compliance, or what we call attainment, with both the federal 8-hour standard for ozone and with the California 1-hour standard for ozone. I believe we are the only air district in all of California who has become attainment for the California 1-hour standard after they had been non-attainment. We still violate the California 8-hour standard for ozone, but as you can see, like all the other ones, we are trending toward cleaner air. Now, this is my cautionary statement. As you can see, what we did when we put together this slide is to show you what our margin of safety is. For the California State 1-hour standard, while we are in attainment, we're just barely in attainment. And if you look, let's see if I could find this. Well, oh, there it is. If you look at this little piece of green up here, that's our margin of safety. So we're very close to being non-attainment there. We have a little bit more margin of safety for the federal 8-hour standard. And then, as I said before, we still violate the California 8-hour standard, and so we have a way to go before we attain that standard. This means we have to continue our vigilance, continue passing rules and regulations, and continue all of the strategies that we've been doing for the last 30 years to attain the other two standards. People often ask me, well, where does our air pollution come from? And these slides are there to show you that. It's very interesting that motor vehicles make up about half of our air pollution, and a very small amount is actually from our stationary sources of air pollution, our factories, the oil and gas industry, all of our industrial sources. And the reason is that for the last 30 years, these sources have been controlled significantly. Also, while the on-road motor vehicles have been are still 50% of our air pollution, they have been controlled very significantly as well. And while we have had a growth in vehicle miles traveled throughout the years, we have also seen a reduction in air pollution from those vehicles because of how much cleaner cars have gotten. There's another interesting piece of the pie here. That is, I always have to talk about, and that is that 43% of our air pollution, nitrogen oxide air pollution, comes from a source that we can't control. And that comes from the container ships that are coming into the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles from South Asia. They go through the Santa Barbara Channel because the shipping lanes go through the Santa Barbara Channel, and they represent 43% of the air pollution currently that affects Santa Barbara County. Out by 2020, we expect those ships to represent 75% of the air pollution affecting Santa Barbara County. We expect that we are going to continue to get gains in reducing air pollution from all the other sectors. And yet, without the very strong action by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, this sector could put us in danger of going backwards in our air quality and actually being non-attainment for the health standards. This demonstrates the statement I just made. As you can see, the blue, the area in, whoops, what did I just do? There we go. Thank you very much. As you can see, we project that our pollutants that we're in control of, the mobile sources and the onshore industrial sources, that we will experience ever decreasing air pollution emissions from those sources, while the marine shipping in the red here emissions we expect to increase. And so we are in the process right now of doing everything we can to get into control of those emissions. We have sued the Environmental Protection Agency. Unfortunately, we've been forced to have to sue them in order to take the correct action to control those emissions. We are also have invested some of our grant funding into the development of innovative technologies, retrofit technologies on some of these ships, and in partnership with APL Shipping Lines, we have actually installed these devices in one of their ships and are currently testing it now to determine if it's cost effective and also that it works in its design in reducing air pollution. One of the newest and most concerning issues that's come about in the last 5 years is the impact of diesel emissions on public health. The particulates that are emitted from the combustion of diesel are the #1 air toxic contaminant in California. There have been several studies, children's health study at UCSB, and also studies throughout Europe that have showed that the location locating people close to major thoroughfares where there's lots of diesel emissions increased their risk of developing lung disease significantly. When we're talking about land use decisions and we're talking about general plans, we have to consider that, because sometimes the only land left to build on is that's really close to major thoroughfares. And you have to consider that when you're designing your communities, to make sure that you don't locate people in areas that put them at risk for increased air pollution. There are tools to help us make those decisions. The California Air Resources Board has a land use handbook that gives communities some general idea about how to build their communities to prevent locating them next to excess health risk due to air pollution. And what that handbook is actually teeing up right now is a bit of a conflict between what's called in our industry the tension between density and exposure. A lot of land use planning now is moving toward denser communities that are more amenable to transportation design, so that we can get people out of their cars. They don't have to travel as far to work. They don't have to travel as far to the store, and we can put them in public transportation. But what happens when you pack people closer together, if you don't take care of your traffic problems, you can increase their exposure to air toxic contaminants. Or if you put people very close to well-trafficked transportation corridors like major freeways, you can increase their exposure to air toxics, and that's something that you want to avoid. Another thing that's come up with the desire to do mixed-use developments is you have to be careful which uses you mix together, because you don't want to put people living next to an industrial use that's going to increase their exposure to air pollution. There are potential mitigations. The kind of jargony one up there, MERV 13, just is a reference to a new high-efficiency particulate filters that can be put on residences that can filter the particulates out and make the indoor living environment safer if these residences are located close to toxic air pollutants. And also, there's a study in Sacramento being done right now about the planting of trees and how they might filter the particulates that come off of trafficked areas and major thoroughfares. From our local perspective, I just think it's important that we all understand that our air quality is improving, and that's a good thing, but we have to retain our vigilance, and we have to continue with the plan that we have to continue to adopt our regulations to keep the air pollution on the downward trend. Diesel emissions is a big concern, and there are many statewide regulations that have recently been adopted to address that problem. Santa Barbara currently has pretty low density, and so one of the things that we're lucky about here is that our exposure to toxics is lower than in other areas. On the other hand, because of the way we have designed our community, as Dr. Jackson pointed out, a lot of people have to drive a long way to get to work. And what that does is increase air pollution someplace else. And so while we might have the benefit of the low exposure due to low density, we have the disbenefit of that of excess emissions from people having to drive too far to get to work. Our future planning needs need to balance this tension between density and exposure, and I think that that can be done through careful planning and to make sure that all of the agencies that are involved in this type of planning work together in cooperation with the community to design the community in a way that we both keep the exposure to toxics down and we also reduce the amount of miles people have to drive to get their shopping done and to get to work. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to go to Brian Welch, and then we'll be talking with the panel and with all of you. We'll use the time as productively as we can to get through our last speaker and get on to the Q&A.
How's this thing work?
Yeah, we'll change it.
Okay.
This is advanced.
Okay. All right. I've spent the better part of my career actually trying to understand better the relationship between urban form and travel behavior, and that's a fancy way of answering questions about why does every major metropolitan area in North America have pretty severe peak hour, peak directional congestion? Why do we have 3.5 parking spaces in North America for every car? You know, those are questions that we know a lot more about than we did, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And what I wanted to focus on in that area just for a few minutes this morning is this whole notion of the relationship between health and urban form. And Dr. Jackson, I think, highlighted a great deal of that, but we know a lot more about this than we did before. And I think there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but now we know that we can measure this. What has happened? You know, some of the public health trends that you've seen, and Dr. Jackson highlighted these. We do know that walking has become much less of a prevalent form of transportation than it historically was. We have built the predominant form of urban development, as we know in North America, since, say, 1940, post-World War II, 1945, has been suburban in nature. Separated land uses, isolating them one from another, and pretty much forcing people to go from place to place in their automobiles. And that's led to a decline. Now we have even more evidence, I think, pointing towards the choices that we're making about urban form and what some of the public health consequences are. Reed Ewing, who is a colleague of mine, as well as Dr. Jackson, he looked at 200,000 people living in different types of urban environments. And he concluded that there's empirical evidence that in a sprawling environment, you're going to have more of a tendency to walk less, higher blood pressure. The study out of San Diego State and Lawrence Frank work as well are all pointing in the same direction. You're probably saying, well, Brian, you know, we all kind of know, you know, these things, but what's really going on? What are the policy implications? Boy, this thing really jumps. What we have to conclude is that the choices that we make as the manner in which our communities are developing and growing, or if you're already a mature community, is that the built environment and the risk of obesity is there are definitely linkages, and there are choices that we can make that affect the outcomes. This is a neighborhood, and I'm just showing you this one example so you can get a sense of how urban form has resulted in differences in travel behavior. This is called the Avenues in Salt Lake City. Something that we're doing as a firm is we're trying to get a much better empirical sense of really what difference does density make? What difference does the diversity of land uses? What difference does transit make in terms of how much people drive? This neighborhood called the Avenues in Salt Lake City, it's a grid system. It's a more traditional neighborhood with smaller blocks. No cul-de-sacs, very, very different than a lot of the post-World War II development. You can go back one. What you notice here in this particular part of Salt Lake City, this one variable design, it's 40% more walkable than the other parts of the region. And so you ask yourself, if you build a neighborhood that big, or a series of neighborhoods that's 40% more walkable, what do you think happens? You get more walking. And what I wanted to emphasize is that, you know, a lot of people are going to say, well, Brian, you look at these maps, you look at different places in North America, why are some states healthier than others and all those kind of things. And some people are going to say, well, you know, Boulder, Colorado is a lot healthier because a lot of healthy people live there because they want to live there. And they move there, so obviously you're going to get a healthier population. What I would argue is, there is something to that whole notion of self-selection, that people do gravitate towards certain types of behavior because that's the way they are. However, I think what's more compelling for me as a professional is the fact that there's a real self-fulfilling prophecy in our land use planning. If you build environments that discourage walking, that make you drive virtually everywhere you want to go, that make transit almost impossible to serve, you are going to get very little walking and very little biking and a lot of driving. And so from that perspective, I think as policy choices, what we have to consider is that you can say, well, 95% of all trips are by car, so why are we even paying attention to the other modes? Well, the whole problem is that we made choices over time that resulted in those percentages. It didn't just happen that way. It was purposeful. So if we're going to change those trends, I think we have to be purposeful in the decisions that we make from now on. And that means that you need to give people at least the option. If you don't, you can say, well, this environment is not dense enough to provide transit. Well, I think there's evidence that you can make changes along those lines. So there's the whole notion of, at least in your planning, make decisions and make choices that give people more options than they're otherwise going to have. Because I think if you don't, we know what's going to result, and all the trends that you've heard about today are going to continue to move forward. But there is the opportunity to do something different, and now we know that the relationships are measurable as well. That's what I had. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you, all of the panel members, for your very concise presentations here this afternoon. And now we'd like to get on to some of the interesting questions and topics that you've raised here through the card method. And one of these, where there was actually a number of cards turned in, had to do with the whole issue of population growth. And that hasn't been addressed really by any of the speakers this morning and as we go into the afternoon. And so the question is, we're asking, well, should we be looking at this as a root cause of the cause, as Dr. Jackson used the expression? Should we be looking at controlling that? Does that have a potential beneficial effect on public or personal health outcomes? So we'd certainly enjoy hearing any comments from any of the panel members on this subject. And Dick, would you like to pick up on that one, please?
Why don't I lead off? When I started medical school, the population of California was 16 million. It is now 38 million. When I was born, the country was 140 million. It's now 300 million. It will be 600 million. By the end of this century. Population and the planet was 2 billion when I was born in 1945, and it's 6 billion now. It is a huge driver of all of these issues, but our consumption patterns, the North American consumption patterns, are so high that they are driving us even more. Of interest, one of the luminaries that came out to argue very strongly against or express great alarm about climate change and the destruction of our environment was none less than Pope Benedict himself, who talked a lot about these issues. There are a lot of benefits that could come from population management. The most effective rate to have a population be at replacement rate is education, empowerment of women. And anything that goes on in a society that improves the knowledge base and economic well-being of our population that's the only thing that really works.
Okay. Any other panel members care to take this up? Terry?
I think it's very interesting to note that while the number of vehicle miles traveled and the number of cars in Santa Barbara has grown significantly since 1970, the number of violations of the state ozone standard, or all ozone standards, has significantly been reduced. And the reason for this is technology. Technology came to the rescue. We were able to reduce the air pollution from the automobiles. We were able to reduce the air pollution from the industrial sources. However, there's going to reach a time when technology is going to have done all that it can do. And then we will not be able to maintain this steady reduction in air pollution if we continue to increase the number of miles that we travel. And we've been lucky so far. We've dodged the bullet simply because of technology, but we can't trust that we're always going to be able to do that. I mean, people like to say, oh, well, there's hydrogen and there's electric cars and there's all sorts of things like that. But you know, you don't really see that that is on the horizon in the short term. We really have to start building our communities in such a way that we don't rely on the automobile so much if we want to continue to make the gains that we've made in the past for cleaning up the air.
Okay, very good. There was another set of questions having to do with some of the points, Ann, you raised in your presentation about the accessibility to quality food or fast food, as the case may be. So some people were asking, well, can we control access to fast food restaurants? Can we limit trans fat, as you suggested? Can we begin to look at limitations on high fructose corn syrup? And then someone asked, did you see the film King of Corn? I'm not sure what that film is about, but perhaps it deals with some of these issues. So I don't know if, Ann, you'd like to take up any of these. And last but not least was a question about, well, how do we educate our children about proper eating, healthy living, and so forth, because all of these things are obviously related.
Wow, those are a lot of questions. Yeah. To start with can we limit the fast food restaurants? Yes, other cities have done that. They've put a moratorium on the proliferation of new fast food restaurants. So they're not closing them down, but as one goes out of business, they'll maybe let another one come in, but they're not letting it just go on and, new businesses starting that way. The trans fat issue that can be done, I believe, on a city-wide basis. I don't know all the, people from the city know a lot more about this than I do, but I know it has been done. New York City did it. So municipalities and states, they have a lot of control over these issues as well. And then the third part was about children and how do we...
Healthy living.
Well, we do have now federally mandated wellness policies that are required in all the public schools in the United States. A lot of us have been involved with working with the school districts on developing, and now we're in the implementation process of these wellness policies. And they specifically have to do with nutrition education, bringing back a lot of the things that have been lost because there's been such an emphasis on the strict academics and kids getting into college and all of these things. So we've lost the basics of nutrition and home economics and PE and how to make PE fun again. And so anyway, the three elements of the wellness policy are nutrition, physical activity, and health education. And those are required elements, and there are groups all over this state, and I know all over the country, that are working on those, so that hopefully will get us somewhere, and hopefully it won't get cut out of the governor's budget.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Brian, would you like to join in?
Yeah, I think a good example is communities often struggle with trying to regulate certain types of businesses because they're allowed by right in, say, commercial districts. But what is, in fact, very effective is you don't allow drive-throughs. And so if you drive around Santa Monica, you're going to drive for a long time before you try and find a drive-through restaurant. They just simply don't allow them.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does work. After the riots in Los Angeles, about half the liquor stores in the city did not allow them to reopen. And crime in those areas, very nice epidemiologic studies showing the crime and all kinds of urban problems went down as the prevalence of liquor stores went down. And I think the same could be shown. I'm just shocked at the political obstruction that the fast food industry puts up against menu labeling and a whole set of controls. I think as a health person's point of view, it's disgraceful.
Yeah, if you look at what the fast food restaurants will tell you is their studies demonstrate that they lose 30 to 35% of their business if they don't have a drive-through. Well, that's that's pretty telling.
Yeah, and I think this goes to the point of the role of research in documenting the connection between access to quality or lack of quality foods and then the public health patterns that Dr. Jackson and others have illustrated here, that if you do have solid evidence, you can begin to establish that nexus and then provide the basis or foundation for public policy and ultimately regulation. There's another series of questions here dealing with the fundamental issue of this whole forum today, and that has to do with the design of the physical environment and health and establishing that connection. And what are some of the more specific policy recommendations that the City of Santa Barbara might entertain as it goes forward in updating its comprehensive plan, its general plan? Maybe this is something Nancy would like to comment on. Obviously, the parks and recreation and open space elements play a key role here, and maybe others can say, what are some of the other key policy areas that would have a potential positive effect on public health, that being one of our core subject matters here. So again, we'd love to have the panel members address that topic. Anybody like to join in here?
I'll take a start at it. I think, you know, it's interesting. I went through and I read the land design element of the current city's general plan in preparing for this. And all of the things that occurred to me, I was amazed to see a lot of those policies are already in there. So yes, there are some things that I think that we could look at and talk very specifically about, but the nuts and bolts are in the current land use element. It really comes down to the political will to make things happen as they should and giving priority to different things. But I do think there are some, and I guess it comes down to policy, but I think that we need to look at use and reuse. We need to look at, when we're looking at development and new development, we need to be asking ourselves about the quality of life for the people who are going to live or work there. And a part of that has to do with transportation. A part of that has to do with access to, you know, grocery stores and markets and things like that, but also access to opportunities to be more physically active and the walkable communities. But I think it really will come down to how much do we want it, that we make it a priority in what we're looking at. I actually want to go back to one comment, if we could, because the opening comment was about, do we need to be concerned about, you know, the increases in population? And I'm not sure that that's Santa Barbara's issue. I think that there are, you know, businesses and agencies existing in Santa Barbara that are fully aware that a third of our workforce that help make our business and government and, you know, corporates all work in the city of Santa Barbara, a third of that workforce comes from the south, and approximately a third of that workforce comes from the north. And so for us as a community, as we look at what it takes to have our community be a success and to thrive, we really have to be talking about recruitment and retention and how do we, that's a part of our extended community. And that, you know, is all related to transportation and all of those kinds of issues. And that's why we have such a big discussion about affordable housing. So that didn't get addressed, and that's the issue that we deal with more as Santa Barbara. And certainly I think, you know, the government stipulation of, you know, the number of housing units that we'll add and all of that, but that becomes the big conversation. So
Okay, very good. Terry, would you like to join in?
I think it's very important when you're looking at doing the long-term planning that that people understand that agencies like the Air Pollution Control District have a very hard time fixing poor planning. When incompatible adjacent land uses are allowed through a planning process, and then all of a sudden people are sort of in an uproar because these incompatible adjacent land uses have occurred, they come to us and they want us to fix them. And we're not really a planning agency, and in fact, I often tell people that unlike a lot of planning agencies that have discretion as to whether or not they allow somebody to build this or that facility or building or business, if a company comes to us and with an application for a permit and they can comply with all of our rules, they get the permit. There's no discretion there. And so it's very difficult for us sometimes when something as simple as a wood-burning pizza oven that gets allowed is next to a 3-story building, and the smoke from the pizza oven goes into the 3-story office building. It becomes very difficult for us to regulate that because you have two people who have rights. One of them has a right to clean air, and the other one has right to make pizzas, and those rights conflict. From a regulatory agency perspective, I would caution thinking that regulations after the planning process are going to repair poor planning.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Excellent points. There's a interesting commentary here. Growing up in Florida in the 60s, all students at my junior high school were required to do 100 sit-ups within 3 minutes, and by the end of the year there was 100% success. What happened to PE, and how do we get it back? Anybody want to take up that issue?
I'll speak to that because that's been something that has been one of those difficult things throughout my career, having seen just the demise of physical education from elementary school all the way through college. And, you know, ultimately it all goes back to funding. I sound like a broken record here, but that's what it is. And that's why physical education doesn't get funded in academic settings in any of those levels. And it goes back again to what are our priorities. And so that's why we don't have PE in our schools. The schools that are lucky enough to have it, that PE element is most likely funded by, you know, a parents group, a PTA, a grant, a fundraising arm for that particular school, not necessarily the school district. It doesn't change the priorities for us as people, but ultimately that is what it comes down to. The second part of that is it really is parental involvement and modeling of behaviors and expectations of behaviors. And all of our lives have changed. You know, we all have, you know, 2 working parents and families. Everybody's busy. You know, how we entertain our kids has changed over the years. It really, I think, if we were going to change one thing for our kids' health, it would be how do we reintegrate physical activity into the elementary schools, and it will grow through the rest of the school system. When I worked at UCLA, we provided recreation programs for students, faculty, and staff. For students, the unbelievable motivator that we could use was that it will help your academic grades. If you are exercising 2 or 3 times a week, we can show you studies that will prove that it will increase your academic performance. You know, it's like making that mind-body connection, but it really comes down to money and being able to fund what we say is most important.
Very good. Dr. Jackson?
Poor schools, in a sense, the principals and directors will say, you know, I had the choice between PE, music, and art, and I picked music and art, Doc, and now I feel bad about it. And No Child Left Behind has really subordinated these other activities, and I think we've got to have a larger view of our education of our children. Yes, it's about money, but we're not going to fix a lot of these problems purely with PE at schools. The activity has got to be integrated back into children's lives. There are a lot of burdens for people commuting 30, 40 miles each way. The risk of death from car injuries, risk of high blood pressure doing all that driving. the risk of not being home for dinner because you're sitting in a car an hour or so each way. I mean, these all begin to add up. And yeah, maybe there are some risks from density, and you get a slightly more ozone if you have people closer together, but you get some real benefits. And maybe we need to stop focusing on very narrow endpoints and think about what's best for the overall human being, the overall family, and the overall community.
And here's a whole series of questions. Let's say we are successful in getting people to walk and bicycle more, then will they not be exposed to some of the elements, as Terry pointed out, air pollution, congestion, lack of safety, smoke from people smoking? So, and I know, Dr. Jackson, you had addressed some of these points that are inherent in the built environment. So,
yeah, I'm just going to push back a little on this, which is that unless people are out there bicycling and exercising, they don't create the political will to then demand safe bike lanes, and you know, none of this is fixed with one single step. It is a societal change, but it does work over time.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Terry?
And I think that this is where the Air Pollution Control District and a very important part of our mission in public education can help out. We had very much success during the Zaka fire of informing people when it was safe to do exercise and when it wasn't. And I mean, with the technology of World Wide Web and all this other electronic technology we have really a great opportunity to communicate with people. And sure, there are days when it's not helpful to get out there and exercise, and we can inform people when those days are. Most of the days in Santa Barbara, we're really blessed, and most of the days in Santa Barbara County, it is helpful to exercise. And should you jog next to the freeway? No. And should we build places where people can get their exercise so they're in places that don't have exposure to things like particulates that are generated by freeway traffic? Yes, we should. But once again, this is where the agencies can work with the community and help educate them and inform them of the right way to get the right kind of exercise.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And Terry, while you're up there at the mic, question was directed at you, actually. How can people who notice severe violations of air quality regulations get in contact with you? What's the mechanism that they can use to perform their watchdog function, so to speak?
You can call us on the phone, 961-8800, and you tell us, and we will investigate it. You can also write us emails. We have a website that you can access and be able to contact us through email. But the fastest way to get action on air pollution violations that you perceive are happening is simply to call us on the phone, and we investigate every air pollution complaint that we receive at the Air Pollution Control District.
So many of the issues that have been raised here have to do with lifestyle choices, healthy living, healthy eating, how we design our environment, and the choices people make in terms of where they live and how they travel to and from home and work and so forth. And so the question grouping we have here has to do with how do we get beyond this car culture that we've created here. We're somewhat locked in, and so I think people are wondering what are some of the incremental steps that we can take as a community to reduce our dependence on those automobiles. Anybody want to take that up, please?
I'll just lead off. Marin County was very concerned their kids weren't walking to school. Only about 10% of the kids were doing it. With very aggressive programs, starting with the PTA, working through the principals, they got it up to about 50% of the kids walking to school. Benefits of that are better crosswalks, bulb outs, traffic calming, better sidewalks, more eyes on the street, better public participation. It became normative to see kids out walking. And not only kids, but now old folks and other folks were out walking. Police officers were on mountain bikes patrolling this same area. And it now seems like common sense, not an oddball event. I think the other takeaway here is you start with the children in many ways, because we did that with tobacco, we did that with a lot of these other issues. It's a good place to focus from.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Any other panel members want to tackle this one?
I think that to me, is one of the biggest areas that we can look at as a community is how do we encourage and make our neighborhoods and our business communities more walkable, because I think, and the Safe Routes to School has been really important. We've seen the connectedness between the schools, and if they have parks adjacent, it just encourages more of that. But I believe the same thing. I think it's just starting in the immediate neighborhoods and making them, getting over some of those barriers that create, that encourage people not to walk, and instead make it a more walkable community. And then looking at the connection between our pedestrian pathways and our trails and incorporating our parks and just making it more of a pleasurable opportunity. I really believe that people will get out there and walk more, making it safe for kids, but making it a pleasurable experience for adults.
And behavior is contagious. You know, what your friends and neighbors are doing affects us.
Indeed. And knowing that we'll have to end the session soon, we have the hall for a limited period of time, we wanted to conclude with one key question here, which is really advice of the panel to our Santa Barbara policymakers. What can they do to overcome some of the major obstacles? What sort of ideas would you like to leave them with as we go forward in updating the city general plan process?
I still own a condo in Sacramento, and 25 years ago when I would go to Sacramento, I hated it. There were vacant lots everywhere. It was not much fun walking around. There wasn't much to do. They have done a wonderful job with that city. There's a lot of four-story buildings. They've gotten rid of the parking lots that were filled with debris. There's lively retail. There's lively community. It's a 24-hour downtown. It really works. And by the way, the tax base, the revenue base, and the quality of life have really improved with the right kind of political leadership.
Very good.
I think I'd like to quote from Dr. Jackson from earlier today, where he said, I put a little box around this. Public health is creating the conditions where people can be healthy. So as we go forward, we need to create healthy environments, including walkability, including grocery stores that have healthy foods in new developments and not just, convenience stores or liquor stores. And just, incorporating these various components that you've heard today that are going to promote health and you're changing the environment around you and not just proliferating the unhealthy behaviors.
Okay, very good. Nancy?
I actually, other than speaking to the leaders who will be being the decision makers, I would speak to the rest of you, because if I've learned one thing from working in local government, it is the voice of the people who show up to talk at meetings about what's important to them as a community member that guides policy. You cannot leave it to the people who are the decision makers juggling everything, because trust me, there will be single-purpose voices out there that will influence policy, and it is important that the community participates in local government. So I encourage you, you've heard a lot of information today about how to improve our community. All those people who are decision makers, they have your best interests at heart. So show up and talk to them about what's important to you. And that really guides policy. So I encourage you to use your voice.
Okay, very good. Terry?
I'd encourage two things. One is use the good science. There's a lot of science out there. There are a lot of analysis tools out there and that are available to help you make your decisions. Don't be afraid of it. All of it can be explained. And I think that if you have your staffs make sure that they bring the science to you and explain and take the time to explain it, that will really help you in your decision-making process. Mm-hmm. And the other is, I guess I'll put under the title of collaboration. A lot of times there can be some polarities develop when you have these kinds of community decisions, to make these community decisions. I run into it all the time. I regulate one of the toughest and richest industries in the United States, and that's the oil and gas industry. If they wanted to, they could come to our board of directors and fight everything we did, but they don't. And the reason they don't is because we at the Air Pollution Control District work really hard to sit down with them and come to solutions that are going to further our mission, reduce air pollution, clean up the air, and allow them the opportunity to comply with our rules in a way that they can continue to do their business. And so I would really advise the decision makers to try to stay away from polarities if they can and move more toward a collaborative model.
Very good. And Brian, to wrap this up?
Well, I think that elected and appointed officials and those that that they're serving, many of the trends that we've seen that have gotten us into the pickle we're in right now are going to require taking positions and stands that right now are going to be not very popular, but 10 years from now people are going to look back and say, thank goodness somebody did this. And what I've seen happen before is that there's usually one or more people who are willing to step out and take what may be going against the grain in an unpopular stand, but ultimately it starts to steer this, this big ocean liner in a different direction. And it's this whole notion of being visionary. And like I say, that if we want to have a 2015 or a 2020 that doesn't follow some of the more disturbing trends, well, things are going to have to change.
Very good. Well, we managed to work our way through pretty much all the questions here, and I want to thank the audience and the questions you turned in, but most of all, let's thank our panel's members and speakers for their comments today. And let's also be sure to thank, once again, Jane Breckwald and the Community Health Coalition for their efforts in putting this whole program together. Thank you, Jane. And all the members of your group, thank you all for coming out today. We hope to have this program rebroadcast on local cable television, so we'll expose more people to the positive atmosphere of this forum, and we hope to see you at future sessions related to Plan Santa Barbara. Thank you very much for your attendance today. Bye-bye.